The transatlantic slave trade, a brutal chapter in human history, involved the forced transportation of approximately 12.5 million Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas from the 16th to 19th centuries, with about 10.7 million surviving the voyage and being enslaved. Millions of West and Central Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, families, and cultures, and transported across the Atlantic in horrific conditions. The trade was part of a larger system known as the triangular trade, where manufactured goods were shipped from Europe to Africa, enslaved people were shipped from Africa to the Americas, and goods like sugar, tobacco, and cotton were shipped from the Americas to Europe. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was characterized by extreme brutality, overcrowding, and high mortality rates. Enslaved Africans were primarily taken to the Caribbean, Brazil, and Spanish America, with smaller numbers going to North America. The transatlantic slave trade fueled the economies of European powers and the Americas, as enslaved labor was used to produce valuable commodities like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The transatlantic slave trade also made a lot of African monarchs wealthy. It was a major source of revenue for the Kingdom of Dahomey, the Oyo Empire, and the Asante Kingdom. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to impact societies today, with issues of racism, inequality, and the need for reparations remaining relevant. Enslaved people resisted their bondage through various means, including breaking tools, damaging crops, and escaping to form independent communities. The Igbo people of present-day southeastern Nigeria actively resisted the transatlantic slave trade through various means, including armed rebellion, suicide, and community-based strategies. They believed in reincarnation and chose to drown themselves in the Atlantic or refuse food, preferring death over enslavement. Those who were taken to the Americas from their homeland maintained their religious practices and traditions, which helped them resist assimilation and maintain their identity. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships were already transporting Africans for use as enslaved laborers on the sugar plantations in the Cape Verde and Madeira Islands in the eastern Atlantic. Spanish conquistadors took enslaved Africans to the Caribbean after 1502, but Portuguese merchants continued to dominate the transatlantic slave trade for another century and a half, operating from their bases in the Congo-Angola area along the west coast of Africa. The Dutch became the foremost traders of enslaved people during parts of the 1600s, and in the following century, English and French merchants controlled about half of the transatlantic slave trade, taking a large percentage of their human cargo from the region of West Africa between the Senegal and Niger rivers. In 1713, an agreement between Spain and Britain granted the British a monopoly on the trade of enslaved people with the Spanish colonies. Under the Asiento de Negros, Britain was entitled to supply those colonies with 4,800 enslaved Africans per year for 30 years. The contract for this supply was assigned to the South Sea Company, of which British Queen Anne held some 22.5% of the stock. Probably no more than a few 100,000 Africans were taken to the Americas before 1600. In the 17th century, however, demand for enslaved labor rose sharply with the growth of sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake region in North America. The largest numbers of enslaved people were taken to the Americas during the 18th century, when, according to historians' estimates, nearly 3/5 of the total volume of the transatlantic slave trade took place. The slave trade had devastating effects in Africa. Economic incentives for warlords and tribes to engage in the trade of enslaved people promoted an atmosphere of lawlessness and violence. Depopulation and a continuing fear of captivity made economic and agricultural development almost impossible throughout much of Western Africa. A large percentage of the people taken captive were women in their childbearing years, and young men who normally would have been starting families. The European enslavers usually left behind persons who were elderly, disabled, or otherwise dependent groups who were least able to contribute to the economic health of their societies. Historians have debated the nature and extent of European and African agency in the actual capture of those who were enslaved. During the early years of the transatlantic slave trade, the Portuguese generally purchased Africans who had been enslaved during tribal wars. As the demand for enslaved people grew, the Portuguese began to enter the interior of Africa to forcibly take captives, As other Europeans became involved in the slave trade, generally they remained on the coast and purchased captives from Africans. The Atlantic Passage, or Middle Passage, usually to Brazil or an island in the Caribbean, was notorious for its brutality and for the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions on slave ships, in which hundreds of Africans were packed tightly into tiers below decks for a voyage of about 5,000 miles that could last from a few weeks to several months. They were typically chained together, and usually the low ceilings did not permit them to sit upright. The heat was intolerable, and the oxygen levels became so low that candles would not burn. Because crews feared insurrection, the Africans were allowed to go outside on the upper decks for only a few hours each day. Historians estimate that between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans bound for the Americas died aboard slave ships. Death rates, which were directly proportional to the length of the voyage, declined as the time of the voyage was reduced significantly between the beginning of the 16th century and the 19th century. The autobiographical account of the West African Olaudah Equiano, published in 1789, is particularly well known for its graphic descriptions of the suffering endured on the transatlantic voyages. Atrocities and sexual abuse of the enslaved captives were widespread, although their monetary value as slaves perhaps mitigated such treatment. Ship captains could not ignore the health of their human cargo because they were paid only for enslaved persons delivered alive. Moreover, the death rates among the European captains and crew engaged in the trade of enslaved people were at least as high as those among their captives on the Middle Passage. In an infamous incident on the slave ship Zong in 1781, when both Africans and crew members were dying of an infectious disease, Captain Luke Collingwood, hoping to stop the disease, ordered that more than 130 Africans be thrown overboard. He then filed an insurance claim on the value of the murdered enslaved persons. Occasionally, the African captives successfully revolted and took over the ships. The most famous such incident occurred when in 1839 a slave named Joseph Cinque led a mutiny of 53 illegally purchased enslaved people on the Spanish slave ship Amistad, killing the captain and two members of the crew. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually ordered the Africans to be returned to their homes. African kings and rulers played a crucial, albeit complex role in the transatlantic slave trade, often supplying captives to European traders in exchange for goods, and sometimes even expanding their own power through slave raiding and warfare. Slavery existed in Africa long before the Europeans stepped foot on the continent. Many African societies had their own forms of slavery, often involving captives from war or debt bondage, which were used for domestic labor or as a sign of status. Debt bondage was particularly common in West Africa, including among the Akan people, the Yoruba people, and the Edo people. It involved the pledge of a person or a member of that person's family to serve another person providing credit. The arrival of European traders seeking slaves to work in the Americas led to a dramatic increase in the scale of the slave trade. African rulers, particularly those in West and Central Africa, became key players in the trade, supplying European merchants with enslaved people. Rulers often traded enslaved people for European goods like guns, textiles, and alcohol, which were valuable in their own societies. The ability to acquire and control enslaved people could also bolster a ruler's power and prestige. Some rulers expanded their territories and gained control of resources by engaging in slave raiding and warfare against neighboring groups, supplying captives to the slave trade. The Kingdom of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, became a major player in the slave trade, engaging in frequent wars to capture people for sale to European traders. The Kingdom of Congo, initially hesitant to participate in the slave trade, later became involved as a source of enslaved people for the Portuguese. Many other West African kingdoms and coastal trading centers played a role in the slave trade, including those in present-day Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. It's important to note that not all African rulers were enthusiastic participants in the slave trade. Some resisted the trade, while others were more ambivalent. The slave trade also contributed to internal divisions, conflicts, and had devastating long-term consequences for African societies, including demographic shifts, social disruption, and economic instability. The treatment of slaves upon arrival, enslaved people were auctioned like property, inspected for physical strength, and often separated from family members. They were given new names, erasing their cultural identities, and were treated as chattel, property under the law. Most enslaved people worked on plantations, producing cash crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugar. They worked long hours, often from sunrise to sunset, in extreme heat with little rest. Housing was cramped and poorly built, with minimal food and clothing. Enslaved people faced frequent whippings, beatings, and torture for disobedience, or even minor infractions. Many were subjected to sexual violence, particularly enslaved women, who were often exploited by slave owners. Psychological control, such as threats of being sold away from family, was used to instill fear and prevent rebellion. Despite the cruelty, enslaved people resisted through work slowdowns, escape attempts, revolts, and maintaining cultural traditions. The Underground Railroad was one means of escaping to free state or Canada. Slave revolts, like Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, showed the fierce desire for freedom despite harsh consequences. Slave codes made it illegal for enslaved people to read, write, or gather in large groups. Laws classified them as property, meaning they had no legal rights and could be bought, sold, or punished at an owner's will. Slaveholders often sold children, spouses, or parents separately, breaking up families permanently. This was used as a form of control, preventing strong family bonds from fostering rebellion. Even free Black people in North America faced discrimination, restrictions on movement, and threats of re-enslavement. Enslaved Africans in South America endured brutal treatment similar to those in North America, but with some key differences. Slavery in South America was more deadly than in North America. Many enslaved people only survived 7 years after arriving due to harsh conditions, disease, and overwork. Instead of allowing enslaved people to reproduce, slave owners often imported new captives, fueling the slave trade. Enslaved people faced whippings, mutilation, execution, and branding to mark them as property. South America, particularly Brazil, was the largest destination for enslaved Africans, receiving nearly 40% of all Africans. Slavery in South America lasted longer than in North America. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. In some regions, enslaved people could buy their freedom or be freed by their owners. But this was rare. Large-scale revolts increased pressure to end slavery. Despite oppression, enslaved Africans preserved elements of their cultures, such as music, dance, religion, and language. African religious traditions blended with Catholicism, leading to practices like candomblé, Brazil, Santeria, Cuba, and Vodou, Haiti. Abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. At the time of the American Revolution, 1775 to 83, there was widespread support in the Northern American colonies for prohibiting the importation of more enslaved people. However, after the Revolution, at the insistence of Southern states, Congress waited more than 2 decades before making the importation of enslaved people illegal. When Congress did so, in 1808, the law was enacted with little dissent. But Caribbean smugglers frequently violated the law until it was enforced by the Northern Blockade of the South in 1861 during the American Civil War. After Great Britain outlawed slavery throughout its empire in 1833, the British Navy diligently opposed the trade of enslaved people in the Atlantic and used its ships to try to prevent slave trading operations. Brazil outlawed the trade of enslaved people in 1850, but the smuggling of newly enslaved persons into Brazil did not end entirely until the country finally enacted emancipation in 1888. The United Nations recognizes March 25th as the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery in the Transatlantic Slave Trade. This day was established by the United Nations to honor the millions of Africans who were enslaved and trafficked across the Atlantic for over 400 years. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.